During a seemingly normal family dinner, the atmosphere suddenly shifted. "Mom, Dad, I have something to share," Colton announced, his hand gripping Elsie's tightly. "We're having a baby, and we want to get married." A heavy silence followed as the news sank in. Grant's face broke into a wide grin. "That's wonderful. We'll have the wedding of the year." My heart sank as I eyed Elsie's rounded belly. Colton was still in college, and they were both so young. "Don't you think this is a bit rushed? You haven't even graduated yet," I pointed out. Colton's expression hardened. "We've made our decision. I want to do this properly and give Elsie the wedding she deserves." "But can we afford an extravagant affair right now?" I pressed, already sensing Grant's enthusiasm overtaking any practical concerns. "Of course we can," Grant declared, waving away my worries. "Nothing is too good for my son and future daughter-in-law." I caught Elsie's uncertain gaze, sensing she shared my reservations about the haste of it all. But Colton barreled on, detailing his grandiose vision of a lavish celebration, while Grant enthusiastically agreed to every excessive idea. As the discussion spiraled, dismissing my attempts to inject reason, a sinking feeling took root. This was more than just the impulsive actions of young love. It was the beginning of a storm that would shake our family to its core. "We'll take care of everything," Grant assured Colton, his eyes gleaming with a reckless determination that made my heart plummet. I knew, deep down, that this wasn't about making dreams come true. It was about feeding Grant's need to maintain an image of success, no matter the cost. And as I looked around the table at my supposed loved ones, I realized that in their pursuit of an idealized fantasy, they had already left me behind. Over the next few days, I tried reasoning with Colton and Grant, but they were deaf to my concerns. Every time I brought up practical matters like budgeting or Colton's unfinished degree, they brushed me off as being negative and unsupportive. "Mom, this is supposed to be a happy time," Colton chided, his voice dripping with condescension. "Why can't you just be excited for us?" Grant nodded along, his arm draped possessively around Elsie. "Mira, you're putting a damper on things with your constant naysaying." I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my temper in check. "I'm just trying to be realistic here. A lavish wedding and a baby on the way? That's a huge financial burden you two aren't prepared for." "We'll manage," Colton insisted, waving away my objections. "Dad's going to take care of everything." My gaze snapped to Grant, who merely shrugged. "Don't worry about the money, dear. I've got it covered." A cold knot formed in my stomach at his dismissive tone. They were treating me like a nuisance, an obstacle to be brushed aside in their pursuit of an idealized fantasy. My own husband was enabling Colton's recklessness, all to maintain an illusion of wealth and success. Elsie shifted uncomfortably, catching my eye. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding there, but then she dropped her gaze, cowed by Grant and Colton's overwhelming bravado. "You're being selfish," Grant snapped, his voice cutting like a knife. "This is about family, about supporting each other no matter what, but I guess that's too much to ask from you these days." The words stung, but I refused to back down. "I'm the only one thinking rationally here. You're both chasing some fairy tale dream without any regard for the consequences." Colton scoffed. "Whatever, Mom. You're just bitter and jealous that we're actually doing something with our lives." Raph, the ugly accusation hung in the air, a harsh slap to the face. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. What could I say in the face of such willful ignorance and dismissal? They had already made up their minds, casting me as the villain for daring to voice any dissent. In that moment I realized the gravity of the rift that had opened between us. This went far beyond a disagreement over a wedding. It was a fundamental divide in our values and priorities. And as much as it pained me, I knew there was no bridging that chasm. Not yet, at least. A few days later, I was going over our finances when Grant strolled in, an unsettling grin plastered across his face. "Good news, dear. I've figured out how we're going to pay for Colton and Elsie's dream wedding." A knot of dread twisted in my gut. "What did you do?" He plopped down on the couch, not seeming to notice my apprehension. "I'm going to take out a chunk from our retirement savings. That should cover everything they need." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You're going to drain our nest egg for a party?" Grant's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing. "It's our son's wedding, Mira, not some party. This is important to him and Elsie." More important than our future? I shot back, anger and disbelief warring within me. We've been planning and saving for years, and now you want to throw it all away on some frivolous spectacle? His face darkened, jaws clenching. It's not frivolous. This is about family, about supporting the next generation as they start their own lives together. But I guess you don't care about that. I recoiled as if struck. How dare you? I care more about this family than you seem to right now. You're risking our financial security on a whim without even consulting me. Grant surged to his feet, towering over me. I don't need your permission. As the man of this house, I'll do what needs to be done for our son. The archaic words hung in the air, a slap to the face. Was this what our marriage had become? Me, the obedient little wife, expected to simply nod and smile at his unilateral decisions? This isn't just about you or Colton, I bit out, fists clenched at my sides. It's our money, our future on the line here. How can you be so reckless? Enough! His roar made me flinch. I'm tired of listening to your nagging doubts. For once, try being supportive instead of dragging everyone down with your negativity. The venom in his voice stung, but I stood my ground. I'm trying to be the voice of reason here. Someone has to consider the consequences beyond this fleeting desire to put on a show of wealth we can't afford. Grant's eyes flashed with rage. Maybe that's your problem. You've never appreciated what I've been able to provide for this family. You're so focused on pinching pennies that you can't see the bigger picture. The bigger picture of living beyond our means? I shook my head, aghast at his willful blindness. This has nothing to do with appreciating you. It's about not bankrupting ourselves for the sake of vanity. But he wasn't listening anymore. With a disgusted sneer, Grant turned and stormed out, leaving me standing amid the wreckage of what was once a partnership of mutual understanding and respect. As the dust settled, a cold realization took hold. Our marriage was already in ruins, and it would take more than placating words to rebuild what we had lost. In the following weeks, Grant and Colton barreled ahead with their extravagant wedding plans, seemingly deaf to my protests. Vendor meetings, cake tastings, venue tours. It was a flurry of excess that left me reeling. "Mom, what do you think of this color scheme?" Colton asked one evening, brandishing a swatch of silks and satins that likely cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I eyed the ostentatious fabrics with trepidation. "Isn't that a bit much? We should be focused on essentials, not haute couture." Grant scoffed from across the room. "Don't be such a killjoy, Mira. This is our son's special day. Cost is no object." Colton nodded vigorously. "Exactly. Elsie deserves to have her dream wedding after everything." "Even if it means going into crushing debt?" I challenged, unable to bite my tongue any longer. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Grant's eyes narrowed to slits. "What are you implying?" I met his gaze steadily, steeling my resolve. "I'm saying that we can't keep ignoring reality here. You've already raided our retirement fund without so much as a discussion. How much further are you willing to go down this rabbit hole of delusion?" Colton flushed an angry red. "How dare you say that to Dad? He's doing this all for me and Elsie." "At what cost, though?" I shot back, frustration bubbling over. "You're both so intent on playing wealthy benefactors that you've completely lost perspective." Grant slammed his fist on the table, making us all jump. "That's enough out of you. I'm the head of this household, and I'll decide what's best for this family." I opened my mouth, desperate words of reason on my tongue, but Colton beat me to it. "Don't bother listening to her, Dad," he sneered, venom dripping from every syllable. "Mom's just jealous that for once, the attention isn't on her and her self-righteous nagging." The cruel barb struck deep, rendering me momentarily speechless. This was my own son speaking, the baby I had cradled and nurtured, now twisting the knife with hateful relish. Grant's expression softened as he turned to Colton. "You're right, son. Your mother has become increasingly bitter and negative of late. But we won't let her bring us down, not on this joyous occasion." Tears pricked my eyes as I looked between the two smirking faces, their bond of arrogant dismissal a sight to behold. In their shared delusion, I had become the enemy, a shrill voice of reason to be scorned and silenced. In that moment, cradling my shredded dignity, I knew I had lost them both to the seductive lure of indulgence and pretense. But a hard knot of resolution took form within me. If they insisted on marching towards self-destruction, blinded by greed and ego, I would ensure they faced the consequences of their choices, no matter how painful the truth might be. As the wedding date loomed closer, I found myself increasingly isolated within my own home. Grant and Colton were consumed by their extravagant planning, oblivious to the mounting costs and debt. Every time I tried to voice my concerns, they brushed me off as a party pooper, too stuck in the past to embrace their grand vision. It was suffocating, this chasm of understanding between us. I felt like a stranger in my own life, a mere spectator to the slow-motion train wreck unfolding before my eyes. And yet, they seemed content to let me drown in their wake of excess and delusion. It was during one of my brooding evenings alone that the idea took root. If Grant and Colton insisted on charging full steam towards disaster, blinded by their arrogance, then perhaps they needed a harsh dose of reality to jolt them back to their senses. The next day, I reached out to Elsie's parents, the Marins. To my relief, they shared my worries about the impulsive marriage and ballooning expenses. Like me, they had watched in growing dismay as our spouses plowed ahead without any regard for prudence or pragmatism. "This entire situation is out of control," Mrs. Marin fretted when we met for coffee. "Elsie is going along with it all, but I can see the doubt in her eyes." I nodded grimly. "Grant and Colton have let this obsession with opulence consume them utterly. They refuse to listen to reason from anyone, especially me." Mr. Marin's jaw tightened. "Then we need to take action. Make them face the consequences of their recklessness before it's too late." A plan started forming then, the first embers of defiance flickering to life within me. If our husbands were too drunk on delusions of grandeur to heed polite warnings, then perhaps a more forceful intervention was required. Over the next few meetings, we hatched our strategy, a way to pull back the curtain on Grant and Colton's deceit without irrevocably damaging our family ties. It was a risky gambit, one that could potentially blow everything apart if not executed perfectly. But I was well past the point of seeking gentle compromise. Grant and Colton had made their priorities clear, and it didn't involve respecting me or my input. They had chosen spectacle over substance, and it was time they tasted the bitter truth of their hollow ambitions. As the wedding date approached, I played the role of demure, supportive wife and mother to perfection. I smiled through the fittings and tastings, all while the Marins and I laid the groundwork for our defiant performance. Little did Grant and Colton know, their big day would be one they'd never forget. A searing spotlight shone on the moral bankruptcy beneath their grandiose dreams. If they wanted a show, I would gladly oblige. And this time there would be no whistling past the consequences. The big day finally arrived in a flurry of chiffon and champagne. Grant and Colton preened like peacocks, basking in the opulence they had manifested through bluster and blind ambition. As I watched them glad hand and pose for photographs, indulging in every excessive whim, a hard knot of resolve solidified within me. No more playing the obedient wife and mother. Today, the debt-fueled fantasy would come crashing down. The ceremony itself was a gaudy, overblown spectacle, every element inflated to grotesque proportions. Colton and Elsie exchanged vows drenched in ostentatious symbolism, the weight of their words obscured by the distracting grandeur surrounding them. As the event transitioned to the reception, I allowed myself to be swept along in the revelry, sipping expensive cocktails and offering vacuous congratulations with a perfectly polished smile. All the while, the Marins and I exchanged furtive glances, mentally reviewing the plan one final time. The moment finally came as the MC took the stage and introduced the newlyweds for their first dance. Colton and Elsie twirled and strutted, awash in a cascading tapestry of lights that likely cost more than my car. My stomach twisted, but I waited, watching the grotesque display of excess with a deceptively serene countenance. When the song ended and the crowd burst into raucous applause, I caught the MC's eye and gave a subtle nod. He cleared his throat, tapping the microphone to silence the din. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have one more special speaker to welcome to the stage." By now, Grant and Colton had rejoined their seats, twin looks of confusion creasing their brows as I strode forward, back ramrod straight. "What's going on?" Colton hissed, but his objection was drowned out by the MC's booming introduction. The mother of the groom, Mira Ralston. A hush fell over the gilded ballroom. All eyes turned towards me, but I kept my gaze locked solely on Grant and Colton, both of whom had gone deathly pale. "Thank you all for being here," I began, my voice carrying with shocking clarity through the tense silence. "Today is meant to be a celebration of love and new beginnings." I paused, letting those words hang briefly before continuing in an icy tone. "However, there are a few things about this occasion that need to be addressed." Colton made a strangled noise, shooting me a pleading look, but I pressed on relentlessly. "This wedding has been billed as a joyous dream come true, the dawning of a bright new future for my son and his lovely new wife." Another pause, this one heavier, more loaded. I scanned the crowd slowly, letting the weight of my next words saturate every witness. But the reality is, this entire event has been bought and paid for through gross financial deception. The tumult that erupted was deafening, gasps and mutters ricocheting through the opulent halls. Grant and Colton were on their feet, faces mottled with impotent rage, but I pressed onwards with righteous impunity. To pay for this decadent circus, my husband ransacked our entire retirement savings, without my knowledge or consent, and that's just a drop in the sea of debt they've recklessly accumulated in pursuit of this ostentatious sham. I locked eyes with the spluttering Colton, my voice dripping with caustic contempt. My son and his enablers have deluded themselves into believing that piling up debt in the name of manufactured success is somehow noble, that sacrificing their integrity and fiscal responsibility on the altar of ego is something to be celebrated. The Marins stepped up beside me then, grim-faced allies reinforcing my verbal onslaught. For a moment, the shrill cries of outrage fell silent, all in attendance rendered gape-mouthed witnesses to this very public reckoning. "So, congratulations," I proclaimed, spreading my arms in cold mockery of their ill-gotten triumph. "You got your spectacle all right, just not the fairy tale you were expecting." It was at that moment that the first exploded, spittle flying as he raged and threatened. But his meltdown, like this entire sordid facade, barely even registered to me anymore. I had drawn my line in the sand. Now there would be a reckoning, once and for all. The aftermath of my brutal truth-telling was pandemonium. Grant and Colton converged on me, spittle flying as they hurled abuse and denials. But I stood immovable, an obelisk of righteous defiance amidst their pathetic attempts at salvaging the illusion. "How dare you humiliate us like this?" Colton raged, his expression grotesque with unbridled fury. "This was supposed to be our day." "Your day built on lies and debt," I shot back, utterly unmoved. "Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences for your runaway arrogance and greed?" Grant seized my arm in a vice grip, his face just inches from mine. "You miserable shrew. After everything I've done to provide for this family, this is how you repay me?" I met his enraged glare with icy disdain. "Provide? You've been living a delusional fantasy at our expense. This expensive monstrosity was all about massaging your fragile ego, not taking care of your family." With a bellow of incoherent rage, Grant raised his hand as if to strike me. But Mr. Marin was there in an instant, inserting himself between us with a firm shove. "That's enough," he barked, eyes blazing. "The only lies and deception here have come from you two. We're simply bringing reality crashing back down where it belongs." Colton whirled on his new in-laws, features contorted in disbelief. "Mom, Dad, you were in on this?" Mrs. Marin lifted her chin, jaw set in grim resolution. "Of course we were. You forced us into an untenable position with your selfish lack of foresight. Did you really think we'd just stand by and let you financially ruin yourselves before your new life even begins?" An uglier side of Colton emerged then, one I had only glimpsed in rare flashes over our deepening rift. "So what? You're taking Mom's side? Betraying your own daughter by buying into this conniving bitch's lies?" The vicious slur hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Elsie, who had remained shocked still through the eruption of chaos, openly recoiled from her new husband's virulence. Before anyone could respond, ushers began filtering through the milling crowds, their presence restoring a tenuous order. "I think it's time some people cooled off," one announced grimly, eyeing Grant and Colton's heaving forms. As they were led away still spewing obscenities, I turned to face the remainder of the stunned guests. Elsie's eyes were haunted, glistening with unshed tears of realization. I imagine this has been quite the wake-up call, I said, projecting over the stuttered din. But believe me, it was necessary after the path of willful deceit this family has traveled. I looked around, taking in the silent witnesses to our sordid unraveling. For too long, I allowed myself to be cowed and dismissed by those too absorbed in their materialistic delusions to apply basic reason or humanity. But no more. Drawing myself up, I met Elsie's turbulent gaze directly. I'm sorry you've been caught in the crossfire of this ugliness. You deserved better than to have the start of your marriage undermined by arrogance and debt. A spasm of emotion flickered across her features, and I saw a flicker of the lost young woman struggling to emerge from beneath the tarnished fantasies heaped upon her. An irrational pang of pity lanced through me despite the circumstances. This was the only way left, I said, mostly to myself. The only way to lance the boil before the infection consumed us all. As the authorities arrived to process the scene, I felt an unexpected lightness, as if a great weight had finally been shrugged off my shoulders. The path ahead was still fraught with challenges and recriminations, but at least now I could walk it with my head held high, free from the shackles of denial and empty pretense. The Gordian knot had been severed. Now it was simply a matter of triaging the wreckage, and for the first time in a long time I felt alive with possibility, uncowed by the delusional forces that had sought to drown me. The war was not yet won, but a pivotal battle had been navigated. I would not go gently ever again. In the weeks following the cataclysmic wedding day, the battle lines within our family were redrawn in harsh, unforgiving strokes. Grant and Colton retreated to lick their wounds, surrounded by an enabling chorus of outraged sympathizers. I, on the other hand, found myself effectively excommunicated, regarded as a traitorous pariah by those who couldn't fathom abandoning the cozy delusions of grandeur. But I didn't care. In fact, their censure was almost freeing. No longer did I have to temper my words or bite my tongue in deference to their fragile egos. The masks had finally been stripped away, leaving only blunt truths to contend with. My first order of business was securing legal separation from Grant and filing for divorce. His response was predictable, a billowing tantrum of indignant rage, followed by a string of half-hearted apologies and promises to change. But I was unmoved, coldly inflexible in my resolve to extricate myself from the fetid sinkhole of our sham marriage. "This is madness, Mira," he'd blustered during one fateful meeting. "We're supposed to be partners, a team. Are you really willing to throw that all away on some self-righteous crusade?" I fixed him with a level stare, undaunted by his bluster. "The partnership you speak of has been dead for years, Grant, ever since you decided that deluding yourself took precedence over respect, honesty, and loving me for who I actually am." His mouth worked soundlessly, excuses and deflections dying on his lips under the weight of my words. For once in our stunted relationship, I had stunned him into stillness and reflection. Of course, it didn't last. "This is exactly why I had to take the reins," he eventually sputtered, reverting to his standard defense of patriarchal self-justification. "You're so mired in cynicism and doubt that you can't even envision success when it's right in front of you." Meeting his scorn with a weary incredulity, I simply shook my head. "Keep telling yourself that. Maybe it'll help numb the sting of realizing that everything you've sacrificed, our future, our integrity, your family's trust, was all for the sake of an insubstantial illusion." He had no response to that, merely turning on his heel to stomp away, once again embracing willful obliviousness over self-examination. It was a pattern I had seen play out countless times over the years, but I was no longer invested in breaking that cycle of delusion. No, I was already turning my focus to the future, plotting out the steps towards financial independence and personal fulfillment, unburdened by Grant's suffocating ambitions. It would be tough, that much was certain, but I drew strength from my newfound clarity. The blinders had been ripped off, and there was a visceral power in confronting reality head-on. Even Colton's protests and railings against my betrayal bounced off with little effect. The man-child I had raised was drowning in his own poor choices, desperately scrambling for something to cling to amid the relentless current of consequences. His indignation held no more weight in my mind than a gnat's buzz. What did sting somewhat was Elsie's silent anguish. In the aftermath, I saw the way she withdrew into herself, the light in her eyes dimming as the renewed hostilities cast her adrift in a sea of recrimination and broken dreams. She had been an unwitting casualty in this whole sordid affair, and that simple fact gnawed at the corners of my resolve. But there was no going back, no avoiding the fallout any longer. So I pushed forward, filing paperwork and separating finances with the crisp confidence of someone who has glimpsed freedom after years of blind servitude. It wasn't the linear happily ever after I might have envisioned in weaker moments, but it was a new beginning, a chance to autograph the next chapter of my life in strokes of honesty and self-determination. The storm might still be raging around me, but I had found shelter in my own uncompromising integrity. All that remained was to keep forging ahead, allowing the lies and pretenses to shatter against my hardened hull. The truth may have sparked fires of resentment, but it would also light my way towards a life of unvarnished authenticity. And that was a flame I would guard fiercely from any forces that sought to smother it again.